Above the Law, a trauma-informed appreciative approach to examining mayoral control of New York City public schools. We will now continue with Cycle 1, initiating Stage 1 definition and the disclosure of my traumatic narrative relating to the governance goal engagement, Part 1. Webster's dictionary defines engagement as emotional involvement or commitment, and NYSED refers to engagement as shared decision making between internal and external stakeholders. However, as summarized, when some education leaders engage in amoral decision making practices that circumvent city, state, and federal laws, they willfully create an inequitable system of the haves and the have nots. According to Wang, 2023, the consequences of corruption include the development of a cultural pathology that breaks down social efficacy and causes organizational dysfunction. To avoid accountability for their unscrupulous practices, leaders like the supervisory regime develop cultural pathologies of engagement based on mobbing, which Lehman 1996 defines as a sophisticated form of harassing, ganging up, and psychologically terrorizing others at work. According to Lehman, mobbing occurs in 4 stages, which I will describe using my experiences with the supervisory regime and their friends. Stage 1, the critical incident. The first stage began with a triggering situation that caused a conflict between groups, and the problem started when I notified executives within the supervisory regime about the illegality of my hiring. Webster's dictionary defines whistleblowing as one who reveals something covert or informs against another, especially an employee who brings wrongdoing by an employer or by other employees to the attention of a government or law enforcement agency. The stress of a whistleblower questioning their malignant decision making and the possible consequences of their destructive actions triggered the supervisory regime's paranoia, which post 1999 defines as a political mental illness requiring the identification of an enemy. According to Post, the paranoid's inability to manage stress causes a need to displace or project unwanted feelings such as guilt, shame, and fear. Rather than problem solving, the supervisory regime fixated on retaliation, specifically the ongoing use of psychological warfare to project their negative feelings against their chosen enemy. The supervisory regime's goal remained to prove its covert belief in the powerful versus the powerless, and its overt argument that identified itself as policy based truth tellers and me as the lying, combative, unprofessional, and disgruntled ex employee. Stage 2, mobbing and stigmatization. While I was questioning the legality of my hiring, the supervisory regime began to implement their norms of mobbing, what Lehman describes as a systematic use of destructive discourse that infringes upon one's civil rights. For example, as evidenced by the conversations presented in the occupational ambiguity videos, gaslighting exists as the core communication style of the pathological. Webster's dictionary defines gaslighting as psychologically manipulating someone, usually over time, so that the victim experiences doubts about their own emotional or mental stability, or to badly mislead or deceive someone, especially for one's personal advantage. The cultural pathology of the supervisory regime began with setting a foundation where I would question my experience, self worth, intelligence, truth, and understanding as a defense and cover up for their evil intentioned decision making. The foundational doubt then created fertile ground for the supervisory regime to execute cycles of engagement based on layman's mobbing activities or attacks against communication, self expression, reputation, professional life, social contacts, and physical and mental health. According to Lehman, examples of attacks on communication include verbal threats and activities to reject the target. Cool 2010, who built upon Lehman's work, described attacks on self expression as ridicule, criticism, nitpicking, intimidation, humiliation, and silent treatment. All 6 occupational ambiguity blame game videos provide a communications timeline that serves as the perfect example of gaslighting and attacks against my communication and self expression. Koo described attacks on one's reputation as false allegations, defamatory remarks, stigmatization of character within institutional networks, and the distortion of truth to justify wrongdoing and project blame. Video number 6 of the Occupational Ambiguity series highlighted how the supervisory regime falsified documents relating to my employment history, stating that not only did they hire me as an assistant principal, but I went on a leave of absence after 2 weeks and then abandoned the position after 6 weeks. Since I no longer worked for the system and would need to seek new employment, future employers now had the opportunity to learn about my work history based on these fraudulent claims. Consequently, any employer questioning these findings, mainly because I never put this position on my resume, could call the New York City Department of Education, where 65 Court Street Human Resources would refer them to, you guessed it, supervisory support, the regime members responsible for the falsified documentation. Attacks on professional life and social interactions. Attacks on professional life and social interactions highlight where the sophistication of mobbing comes into play, as the goal remains to enforce social isolation and leave you in a defenseless position. Based on their understanding of the inability of an individual to conquer a group, the supervisory regime or paranoid leaders would need to solicit a paranoid collective to carry out their destructive attacks. According to Post 1999, psychologically healthy persons grow beyond child reactions of fearing strangers and develop defense mechanisms for dealing with stress. However, architects of hate, or primitive psychological savages, hoard destructive feelings and deep fears that they seek to project outward via defensive aggressiveness against the chosen enemy. Once the architects of hate gather their collective, they instill fear about and discuss strategies for attacking their chosen enemy, thus giving the paranoid collective conspiratorial power to attack their target. Remember, the NYSED report discussed the DOE's ability to coordinate municipalities due to external relations with public and private entities as a benefit to the system of mayoral control. However, my trauma proves how some persons, like the psychological savages of the supervisory regime, utilize their external contacts to attack my professional life and social interactions by engaging in excessive snooping and monitoring of my personal and professional life, recreating illegal situations that occurred during the ghost assistant principal position, creating work settings based on ambiguous job descriptions, marginalizing, ostracizing, and using others to act as informants regarding my daily interactions, and ridiculing me and questioning my credentials and abilities. The falsified employment history and a resume that didn't match made it easy for the supervisory regime to establish a reason for mistrust and thus fear amongst future employers in the field. Additionally, leaving the DOE and remaining in the tri state area for a job in the teaching and learning profession means constant contact with DOE partners and fingerprinting and background checks with the DOE. So, officials like the supervisory regime always know where and when you seek employment and can thus infiltrate your job search, professional life, and social interactions with their influence and pathological behaviors. Attacks on physical and mental health. Kinney et al.'s Normative Power and Violence and Whistleblower Retaliation best explains the attacks on my communication, self expression, reputation, professional life, and social interactions. After being charged with wrongdoing, the accused attachment to organizations causes them to attribute anthropomorphic powers to the institution. Thus, they need to utilize normative violence and power to defend the organization and recreate the identity of their accusers. Normative violence comes in the form of retaliatory discourse that uses mental health as a weapon to discredit the whistleblower and weaken their claims against the organization. As the organization strategically plans for situations that cause psychological stress for the accuser to act out their claims of mental illness, the whistleblower, in turn, uses the same discourse on mental health to explain the impact of the retaliation on their well being, thus accepting the identity given to them by the organization. I speak from the heart when I say I have experienced these constructs before, during, and after encounters with the supervisory regime. Up next, we will continue with Cycle 1, Stage 1 of the Appreciative Informed Resonant Transformation by disclosing my traumatic narrative as it relates to Part 2 of Governance Goal Engagement. See you there.